We're excited to present to you. We're the Port of Stockton industry shipping team, and we've explored the effects of emissions and electrification at the Port of Stockton. I'm Erica, and I'm going to pass it off to Tony to talk more.
How do I? Focus. Okay. Sorry.
Spoilers.
Okay, thanks. Okay, sorry for that. So the story of our project starts at the Port of Stockton. As mentioned earlier, the port is the fourth busiest port in all of California, and it is a very important economic driver for the city of Stockton. However, in recent years, concerns about the pollution that is created by the port processes has been raised, and we would like to address that with our project. So our vision has been to reduce the pollution of the Port of Stockton, to increase the health and quality of life of communities that live in close proximity to the port, for the Port of Stockton to stay a competitive player in the shipping industry that is very vulnerable to climate change, and lastly, to sort of inspire change on the state, federal, and even global level with an electricity transition.
Okay, you might ask what the Port of Stockton is currently doing, and they're doing quite a lot, actually. Right now, they're prioritizing EV drayage trucks, and currently all new trucks starting January this year have to be EV. And this is in hopes to transition an entirely zero emission vehicle fleet by 2035. Currently, about 40% of the cargo handling equipment is electric today, and the remaining 60% is hopefully going to be electric soon. Currently, they've applied for a grant to provide funding for the rest of that transition. And lastly, the complete elimination of tanker ship at berth emissions by 2027 is the current stated goal.
While these efforts are already a really good start in the right direction, we have proposed a different goal, which would be zero carbon by 2030. Now, we've designed a preferred state to sort of visualize what it would mean to transition to that goal. So we start with the emissions from the port, which would negatively influence the air quality in Stockton. We then would see an increase in diseases, in respiratory diseases, asthma in nearby communities, which would then allow for more public awareness, or like for public awareness to increase. That would then positively influence community engagement in the area, which would then allow for more government action in the form of policy implementation, which would then lead to more electrification of port processes, and then that would reduce overall emissions from the port, and that would be a balancing feedback loop that we have sort of described here. And that would ultimately allow us to reach our goal of zero carbon by 2030.
So what's currently coming in the way of our desired state and the Port of Stockton completing it? So some current struggles and challenges. A little background: when the California Air Resources Board approved the Community Emissions Reduction Program, which is CERP, they agreed and highlighted how they wanted to understand more about the emissions generated by the Port of Stockton and release more emissions inventory. However, since this has been approved, only two emissions inventory have been released for 2018 and 2020, and they're currently working in the 2022 one. So as you can see, we acknowledge that there has been like a delay, and it takes time in order for these calculations to be made. So as a team, we wanted to help to the Port of Stockton seek for ways that they can release emissions trends and the emissions generated. So we decided on the goal of replicating their inventory results for the missing years from 2016 to 2023 for ocean-going vessels. The reasons why we decided to situate ourselves in ocean-going vessels, it's because in their report, they show how 70% of the port's emissions are accounted from the OGVs. So how did we do this? We did two methods, a front end and a back end. I'll walk you through the front end, and then Jill will walk you through the back end. So the front end is following the Stockton emission report methodology. I'm gonna walk you through it now. For understanding, every vessel has two operational modes, which is berth hoteling, that is when they're loading and unloading cargo, and then maneuvering, that it's when it's moving around. Every vessel has three major engines that are major emitters. So it's the auxiliary engine that generates electricity for the vessel, the auxiliary boiler that generates hot water and steam, and the propulsion engine that helps move the vessel around. This is the equation they use in the report. So emissions equal operational load that accounts for the power used by the engine, time active hours of the engine, time emissions factor that depends on the type of the engine, times fuel correction factor that depends on the fuel of the engine, and the control factor that accounts for any new technology in order to reduce emissions. So when we were calculating the emissions when berth hoteling, only the auxiliary engine and the boiler are being used. So the emissions equation can be simplified, and when calculating it for maneuvering, all the engines are on, so the emission includes every factor. To get our data, we use the Automated Identification System AIS website. So that's a website that tracks ships in US and international waters every 5 minutes and gives us the characteristics of the ships. So we created a boundary and assumed, as you can see in the picture, and we assumed that every ship inside this boundary was going to the port of Stockton. So we requested the data from 2016 to 2023, processed it through the code, and got our results.
So thanks to these calculations, we're able to expand our understanding of trends of emissions at the Port of Stockton from 2018 and 2020, pictured here, to 2016 to 2023. Of course, as always, we do have notable exceptions. In 2020, we all remember the global pandemic. This did impact business at the Port of Stockton, thus we do see a lower emission number from that year. 2022 was the West Coast longshore and warehouse union negotiations, which impacted the rate at which ships were going in and out of Stockton, leading to longer times at berth that year. We see overall in this trend of our PM 2.5 emissions that we see pre-pandemic, we see a emission flatline at around 4 tons of PM per year, whereas in this post-pandemic world, we're seeing an increase in their overall standard of emissions, although we do have less data points to base this increased trend off of. And looking forward, it will be interesting to see how this continues. So as noted, we did calculate emissions a different way. Before we had fully finished the method Mia had shown you, we made some assumptions that emissions are essentially the time ships spend at port converted into a factor of tons. Doing this with our code, we know we could differentiate between cargo and tanker ships at the port. Thus, we're able to make an equation where we have two knowns from 2020 and 2018. Knowns from 2016 to 2023, and two unknown conversion factors. Solving for those and applying them from 2016 to 2023, we get the following data, which you may recognize follows a very similar trend. In comparison with our other calculations, we see a very tight trend staying around 4 pre-pandemic and then the same rise post-pandemic, which gives us some confidence in our results.
So a big leverage point that we see in our system is policy. As Mia already said, about 70% of all emissions at the port are due to shipping, ocean-going vessels. So we would like to find ways to incentivize electrifying ships or attracting green industry partners. So that could look like lowering the rent for port properties for new green industry partners to enter the port, or even lowering the cost of loading and unloading of cargo. Another thing that we have mentioned is that in the realm of information-based policy, we would like to see more estimates of annual emissions from ocean-going vessels. It doesn't have to be a full emissions inventory, but it would increase transparency and we would gain more clarity on the emissions on an annual basis.
And just another example of to support our argument is the Port of Oakland. They currently have 90% shore power plug-in rate, and they have decreased their emissions while increasing their cargo output. So it is definitely a possibility for Stockton.
And then lastly, the California effect in climate policy describes, well, there's a quote attached here, but we basically would like to see the Port of Stockton to become a leader in the climate policy realm and sort of inspire other ports to follow suit. So with stricter regulations on the port level, we might see other ports in proximity or even on the global level to sort of do the same and implement more regulations that would then propel a transition outside of Stockton and on a bigger level.
Thank you. And moving forward, we've created a story map that we encourage you to look at and interact with, just to highlight the summary of our semester-long project. Thank you.